Present day. Present time.
In this day and age, it is important to stay socially active. If your friend sends you an email request, you have to accept, right? It's common courtesy after all. But what if you know that that friend took their own life just yesterday? Is it all just a prank, or something far more sinister?
Serial Experiments Lain. Cooro's Retrospectives.
Serial Experiments Lain is a name that often pops up in anime discourse. It is supposed to be one of the cult classic shows, but whenever someone asks what it's actually about, things start getting a little bit difficult. Well, to put it simply, SEL is a show that warns us about the dangers of the internet. Which of course you're all scoffing at right now, because it is silly, it's not a new concept, it's not that interesting nowadays. But what if I told you that the show is almost 27 years old? That makes it way more impressive. Yeah, that is actually right. SEL was released in 1998. Which does not make me feel old at all, so please stop asking about it or I will cry. The story deals with topics like cyberbullying, hackers, and there's even like a subplot about self-driving cars that get remote controlled and run over pedestrians. The show was so ahead of its time in theming alone, like, it has to be perfect, right? It has to be amazing, it has to be this misunderstood masterpiece, this amazing... Well, let's take a closer look at it.
Story. Layer 01.
The story starts out with a bang. We see a middle school girl standing on a rooftop. It doesn't take us long to understand that she's about to end it all. The music is dreary and depressing, and it perfectly sets the scene for what is about to happen. The girl plummets towards her ultimate demise, and some very cryptic text fills the screen, and this is the precise moment where we realize what kind of a show SEL truly is. Because this is what SEL loves to do every 10 seconds or so. It just info dumps a bunch of stuff that we do not understand yet and have no context for, but it wants us to see it anyways. If you're waiting for an explanation for what we just saw, you're going to wait a long time. Because SEL is not concerned with such petty things like, I don't know, context or a viewership that understands what's going on. So, we're going to sit here for a while until anything starts making sense. After this rather effective opening, we get introduced to our main character. She's called Lain, and she goes to the same middle school as Roof Girl. But she's not just some boring middle schooler, no, she's wearing the maddest drip you've ever seen, boyo! But her clothes aren't the only thing that's weird about her. She's very quiet, keeps to herself, and doesn't talk to anyone. Our protagonist, ladies and gentlemen, a total freaking nerd. A classmate walks up to Lain and talks to her about something very important. This classmate is called Arisu, and she becomes the best friend of Lain later in the show, so she's a very important character. Something to note that might be interesting is that the show and the subtitles on my Blu-ray call this girl Arisu, but her name is actually Alice. Alice as in the Lewis Carroll Alice in Wonderland, and this is clearly a reference to that work. But I never realized that while watching this show for the first time, because the screen and the people in it were lying to me. So I'm telling you right now. Alice tells Lain that Roof Girl, the girl who ended her life yesterday, keeps sending emails to people even though she isn't around anymore. Which of course is impossible because
A dead person can't write a letter.
But of course, Lain is an asocial weirdo, so she fumbles her way through the conversation until it awkwardly stops. Then she sits back down and stares at the blackboard for a while. Then smoke starts coming out of her fingers. Yes, smoke comes out of her fingers. No one reacts to this. This seems to be perfectly normal. Or not, it never happens again. Who knows? But of course, Lain can't ignore this information for long. After all, she also wants the tea. So she goes back home, sits down at her desk, and opens up a computer that looks like a weird mixture between a Pokédex and a Macintosh. Honestly, I would love if our modern PCs looked like this because it is freaking cool. It's like a weird, sorta modern, sorta Stone Age hybrid. It looks really interesting. So, she opens up the computer, logs in with her fancy voice recognition software, and then she starts writing emails with the dead girl, which is crazy because
A dead person can't write a letter.
they exchange messages back and forth until the dead girl drops some real deep knowledge on Lain by proclaiming God is here. Christian rhetoric seems to be where Lain draws the line because she immediately flees the conversation. Something I can understand very well because if I see a pastor, I also run the other way. Soon we get to meet Lain's family, and we immediately see that her mother is a stone cold B-word because Lain tries to explain to her that a classmate took her own life, and this is her reaction. Delightful. Her father, on the other hand, seems to be a real tech nerd, spending all his time on his computer, which actually looks freaking amazing. This man knows how to have a good time. He spends his entire time in The Wired, which is this world's internet. He lectures Lain on all the amazing connections she could have on The Wired, while he's ignoring the connection to the daughter that is standing right in front of him. It's just classical dad of the year behavior, everyone. Lain doesn't understand any of this techie futuristic stuff, but people keep telling her to get online more. But of course she refuses, cause she is a loser that does not want to connect to other people. So why should she go on The Wired? Suddenly we're in a new scene of Lain riding the train. It goes on for a bit until there's an accident because some girl just jumped on the train tracks. What the hell? We then switch to a scene of Lain standing on some train tracks and seeing a girl jump right in front of the train. Then Lain wakes up and she's in her classroom. What is happening? Was it a memory? A dream? A disturbed fantasy? Well, get comfortable not knowing what's going to happen, because there will not be any explanations, as I told you already. Roof Girl then starts to communicate with Lain via the blackboard. Hard cut and we see Lain meeting Roof Girl on the street. Then she vanishes into thin air. What the hell is happening? Is she a ghost? Because maybe she's a ghost, but she's communicating with everyone over the email account, so what is going on there? How is that even possible? Are they going to explain that to us? No, of course not. This is the end of the first episode. This is how it ends. They don't explain anything. They just dump a giant bucket of question marks on our laps and just expect us to sit with it for the rest of the runtime of this show. You think I'm being cynical? Let's have a look at the second episode and see how much they explain to us.
Present day. Present time.
We get introduced to a new drug called Acela, or it's not really a drug, but it's used like a drug, so you take it, ingest it, and then it accelerates your brain. It's like this tiny machine doing all this stuff. Is it important to the plot? Not really, just for this episode, but they go into massive amounts of details to explain it to us. The next day, Alice and her gang walk up to Lain. They explain to her that they saw her in a nightclub just yesterday. Lain explains to them that this is impossible because she's a total loser who never leaves the house, so it couldn't have been her. Reluctantly, Alice accepts this information, but she says it could have been Lain's doppelganger. She asks her if she wants to come to the club with them tonight so she can see for herself. At first, Lain refuses, but Alice can be very persuasive. So in the end, they all agree to go to Siberia, the coolest place in town. No, not this Siberia. That would be too cool. No, we're talking about Siberia. This place. Supposedly, this place is a really awesome nightclub that for some reason is almost exclusively visited by children. Like for real, our group of girls are all middle schoolers, and in the next episode we see that a bunch of grade schoolers are hanging out as well. What kind of a weird kiddler diddler den is this? The girls are having fun until another kid, completely juiced up on a cellar, starts shooting women around him. He goes absolutely mental as soon as he sees Lain. He then threatens her with his gun and starts screaming weird stuff. Apparently he knows her from somewhere else and is absolutely scared of her, which I can kind of understand because she gives me the creeps as well. Lain starts staring at the man and acting like the little psycho she is. So she just walks up to him with no concern for her own safety and tells him that
Everything is connected. Nothing is also connected.
Then the guy starts crying and just shoots himself in the head. End of episode. What the hell is going on? From here on out, things start accelerating at a very brisk pace, almost as if the show itself had taken some Acela, if you catch my drift. Lain's dad gets her a new computer and she starts surfing the Wired more and more. She gets pulled deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole and things are starting to get freaky. Something is up in the Wired. Kids start dying all around the city and Lain starts to gather more and more information about this so-called god entity everyone keeps talking about. He seems to be hiding out somewhere on the other side. If you sum it up like this, it sounds pretty cool actually. The problem is that the show portrays this in a very confusing and very convoluted way. Of course, opinions are very subjective, but from my perspective, this show is really annoying sometimes. There's a main narrative thread that rears its ugly deformed little head from time to time, but it's usually submerged in 50 shades of tech babble and convoluted backwards storytelling that bloats the runtime, but doesn't serve any other point besides confusing the viewer. It's a mystery, yes, but only because the story is told so incomprehensibly that you have to guess what it actually means. Now you might think I'm just too stupid to understand the plot, but that is not the case. After all, I'm a Rick and Morty fan and I laughed at Pickle Rick, so I clearly have to be the smartest person in the room, right?
I turned myself into a pickle, Morty!
No, but all jokes aside, I understand the plot of SEL, or at least I think I do, because I did a ton of research about it, so I could understand it, but after watching the show for the first time, I was just left confused and a little baffled, and after doing a lot of research about it, I started to understand what it's all about, how it all works, and then it became more interesting to actually watch the show. But as long as you don't understand what's going on, it's just a very confusing and aggravating mess. Some people may like that. For example, my best friend think it's really cool. I think it's very annoying, and I think this way of storytelling just serves like the elite few who actually get it, instead of actually telling an engaging story for everyone to like. And I think that is pretty sad, because at the core, there is a very interesting story, but it's just not very accessible to most people. But that is actually okay, because story isn't the only relevant factor when it comes to determining if a show is good or not.
Animation. Layer 02.
Lain is old, almost 27 years old to be exact. And of course that age is going to show in its animation quality. The aspect ratio is 4:3, the animation is choppy and slow, the character models look weird and bloated at times. A lot of the scenes aren't very dynamic. They use a lot of static frames to convey the rather slow-paced story. It's definitely not the prettiest art style, but it gets the job done. I know a lot of people can't stand the look of older anime, but I personally think that they look quite charming. You can clearly tell that they spent most of their budget on making Lain and the tech look as good as possible. The rest of the characters and world suffer for it sometimes. The color palette is drab and lifeless, but that is by design. Almost every screenshot of the show looks depressing and bleak, which brings us straight to the most important component of this show.
5. Layer 03.
SEL oozes vibe from every corner. This show is vibe incarnate. You're asking what this vibe is? Dark, depressing, angsty, and very hopeless. The show makes you feel the oppressive force of technology from second one. The bleak realities of an ever-evolving world are laid bare in front of your eyes. SEL never pulls any punches, and has no problems with making you feel uncomfortable for its entire 13-episode runtime. As mentioned in the second layer, the colors are dreary and lifeless, everything feels weird and inhuman. The sound design and music are uncomfortable and unnatural. The flickering of screens, the clacking of keyboards, all accompanied by an eerie song selection that will make your spine tingle. Every episode opens with the same weird sequence. A computer screen displaying the message, "Present day! Present time!" What does that mean? Who knows? But it makes your skin crawl. Few shows manage to create an atmosphere that is as dense as this one's is. I immediately have to think of David Lynch when I watch it. It gets the same sort of eeriness across as something like Twin Peaks. Lain as a protagonist is extremely effective in that regard as well, because she's so emotionally stunted and awkward that you immediately feel ostracized from the strange and cold world. Just like the protagonist, you can't connect to the setting around you, because it is so hostile in nature. The way the show portrays technology is also very unique. It sort of feels like a softcore cyberpunk setting. If I had to describe it, it feels like a world that is 10 years away from becoming a cyberpunk dystopia like in Blade Runner. The tech is getting there, but it's not implemented in everyday life yet. Everything besides the wired and home computers is still very low tech. This creates this interesting limbo between two well-known fictional settings. This is what makes the show feel uniquely Lain-esque. Nothing else captures this weird sense of dread and personal isolation like SEL does. It is incredibly effective at this. In a strange way, the vibes grab the reins of the show and leave the plot in the dust for most of the show's runtime.
Philosophy Layer 04.
Philosophy is another core building block of the Lain formula. The entire show is stuffed to the brim with questions about humanity and identity. What makes us human? Do we need a body to connect to others? Why is Siberia only frequented by kids? Jokes aside though, there's a lot of very deep, emotional and philosophical discussion to be found in this show, which strongly sets it apart from its competition. I mean, what else came out in 1998? The Pokemon movie? Cowboy Bebop? Initial D? Oh my god, Initial D!
Deja vu, I just been to this place before. Higher on the street and I know it's my time to go. Going new and the search is a mystery. Standing on my feet, it's so hard when I try to be me.
What the hell? Anime in 1998 was freaking awesome! Wait, Sexy Commando came out in 1998? What quality? What charm! Okay, I kind of got distracted there for a moment. As you can see by the selection on the screen, at this point some anime started to get into some more philosophical topics, but they were more focused on telling a fun, action-packed story. But Lain just wasn't afraid of anything, no. It dives headfirst into all of the drama and philosophy and motorboats the crap out of it. This show lives for all the deep thoughts and reflections, just like Evangelion did 3 years prior.
Opening and ending. Layer 05.
The opening of SEL is pretty neat. The song is called Duvet and is performed by the band Boa. It is a very interesting listen because the vocals have a very ethereal and otherworldly quality to them. The opening depicts Lain on many digital screens around the city, eavesdropping into people's lives and conversations. She is everywhere at once, but no one notices her. A very poignant display that you can only fully appreciate after completing the entire show. The ending, on the other hand, is nothing to write home about. An old man sings a song that is neither very inspiring nor melodically interesting. The only image on screen is that of a naked 14-year-old girl, so I hope you are okay with me not showing that nonsense here. It does not serve any significant purpose.
Conclusion. Layer 06.
SEL is a different kind of beast. It definitely doesn't fit into any of the typical boxes. It's not techy enough to be a full-fledged cyberpunk story, it is not scary enough to be a real horror show, and for being a thriller, it has a lot of very quiet and surreal moments. The only word to describe this show is unique. Everything about it was unique and revolutionary for its time. Somehow the writers managed to create a show that is more relevant today than it was 27 years ago, and that is insanely impressive. I'm struggling to come up with a precise rating for this, because this show is so different. In the plot department, I'm struggling to give it anything more than a 5 out of 10, at least on the first viewing. The way the story is told is very confusing and counterintuitive. You feel constantly lost and you have to put in a lot of work to stay focused on the plot, because it certainly isn't keeping the focus on its own accord. At times, it's so convoluted and annoying that I felt like dropping the show entirely. Of course, it's an entirely different story if you completely finish the show, then do a ton of research and come back and watch it again, because then you will understand the plot, all the details will start fitting into place, and it's gonna be a lot more enjoyable than before. But the one thing that actually kept me going was the vibe. The eerie feeling that the show creates is like no other, and I'm very glad I saw it. This show is an experience, and that experience is definitely worth a 7.5 out of 10 in my opinion. If we now add in the fact that this show was so ahead of its own time that it practically did a Doctor Who, I would award it an extra point on the scales. That means that we have a very satisfying 8.5 experience in our hands. I personally recommend that any anime fan should give this show a watch and experience it for themselves. It is that iconic. But me personally, I'm a big plot and character guy, so this show just doesn't do it for me in that way. I can definitely recognize all its achievement, but at the same time, it's just not for me. The way the plot of the show is structured is actually maddening to me. It's kind of funny because my favorite anime of all time, Higurashi no Naku Koro ni, has kind of a similar structure because it bombards you with a lot of questions at the start and you need to watch the entire thing to understand it. But with Higurashi it's different because Higurashi pays everything off, it explains everything to you and it wraps it up in a neat little bow, and the characters are way more interesting to me. But with Lain, it's a different story. I don't enjoy watching Lain as a protagonist. She is dull, emotionally stunted, and reacts in a very subdued manner to everything that happens around her. I don't know, there's something about this show, but it's difficult for me. It's like going to an art gallery. You see a painting that you can clearly tell was crafted with intent and purpose, the art is clearly well made and uses a lot of very innovative ideas, and you realize that you just can't stand it. You would have preferred different colors, maybe a different frame. I mean, this painting is neat, but why do you have to look at it sideways to understand it? And so, after all this yammering, Serial Experiments Lain is not for me. Is it the masterpiece that a lot of people claim it to be? It just might be. I can't tell. Honestly, that was my opinion when I wrote this script. But working on this video, recording all the lines, watching all the footage again, just gave me a new appreciation for this show. And I'm so glad that I watched it and spent all this time with it. So after all, in my heart, the way I see it, the show is a masterpiece. But it will be forever misunderstood.